Preparing to live stream, setting up. Okay, good. Okay, I think we're on Facebook, everybody. So yeah, welcome to session 2 of PKD, VALIS, and practices of ultra metacognition. Hopefully you can hear me all right on Facebook. If you have any issues on Facebook or on the webinar on Zoom, just let me know in the chat and I'll help you out. We will be definitely screening comments from the Facebook Live. So if you're tuning into us from the Facebook sphere, don't hesitate to punch in your questions because we'll definitely be reading those. So yeah, this week we are doing Do Androids Dream of Electric Empathy, session 2. And Richard Doyle is once again joining us from his home near Penn State, I believe, somewhere abouts.
Undisclosed location.
Yes. Yeah, so our homework assignment, our loose homework assignment was to read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And here's my old Blade Runner edition. And search for encounters of ultra metacognition. So I'm just going to pass the mic over to Rich and welcome you back, Rich. And thanks so much for an interesting week, to say the least, while reading this.
Oh, good. Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Jeremy. I look forward to another dialogue. Last week was really energizing, and it invigorated my return to these books. I mean, the first thing that has to be said is that working with these books, working with a writer of the kind of fecundity that PKD was, that this is a lifelong practice. We think we know what a book is about, and we have a kind of abstraction about it in our minds that focuses on key events or a feeling tone, maybe. Like Ubik is, for me, a book that is about the feeling that it induces in me. Three Stigmata, a slightly different feeling that I return to. But when I go back to the books and I let myself slow down on them and I empty myself of what I thought I knew about those books in a kind of deliberate fashion, then, they're fresh in this way. They reveal this infinity of paths of exploration and inquiry that, we're always there, and maybe one came across it in a previous reading, but didn't quite light you up in the same way. So it's really, again, we have to kind of jettison this idea that a book has a beginning and an end, and that books are things that you read and then you're done with them. Instead of that, there's a universe of texts that are produced by, the logos, essentially channeled through individual beings periodically. And we grapple with this. And as we grapple with those and we get seduced by them and we love them and we become frustrated by them, or we become panicked by them, then we're really engaging in a kind of act of radical introspection, because what we experience each time we return to a book, or it takes even, over a matter of minutes or days, that, we're experiencing the way in which we're, somebody else is reading it. This is a different being who is reading this book. There is no one Richard Doyle who has read these books and then remains the same, and the books somehow give their information to them when he looks at them again, because he just hasn't remembered. Instead, that he gets solicited into different paths, solicited into different encounters. And what I was solicited into this time, was this experience, this practice of radical empathy. So I thought what I would do is start off with just a little bit of a tiny recap of last time, so that we can have a framework about ultra metacognition that we bring forward, and then maybe explore a thread of this problem. Where does this problem of, or the impasse that generates the need for ultra metacognition come up in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And luckily, it comes up more or less on the very first page of the book, and where the practice and experience of radical empathy is a kind of path or solution to the impasse that gives rise to ultra metacognition. So I'll try to explain that. But suffice to say that I'm really glad we're beginning with this book, because PKD's books can be seen to be and are very kind of heady books, right? They're cognitively overloaded. They ask your mind to do things, and we can find ourselves sort of turning back on ourselves using our minds. But it's also important to remember, particularly androids, that Dick is a writer with such extraordinary compassion, and whose suffering I think we feel as we read the exegesis or we read some of the novels. So this move, maybe, if you'll excuse the phrasing, away from the head a little bit and towards the heart, I think is a good way to ground or kind of begin an inquiry that focuses on the reading of Philip K. Dick's text, and not just the talking about Philip K. Dick's texts. So briefly, to go back to what is this experience of ultra metacognition? Well, we can begin with just a kind of rough definition that metacognition, that all of us are capable of and we practice regularly, is the action of observing the fact that we can know something. We watch how we readily learn a language, or we do not readily learn a language. So that's an act of thinking about our own cognition. I can observe that I am saying these sentences right now, so I'm engaging there in act of metacognition, cognition about cognition. But ultra metacognition arises when metacognition comes into kind of paradoxes, and we'll look at one of those in a minute. But it often occurs when we cannot solve a problem on the level of metacognition, such as, I seem to not be very quick at picking up Sanskrit characters. Why is that? And I can just try over and over and over again, and I don't really observe what my obstacle is to learning these Sanskrit characters. But if I look back at myself one level further, and instead of just observing my act of cognition, I ask, who is it who's experiencing this cognition? Who has a problem learning Sanskrit characters? And then I look back with my awareness. I don't just ask it verbally or linguistically. And I look for the one who has a problem learning Sanskrit characters, and there isn't anybody there. There isn't anybody that has any trouble with Sanskrit characters. They're just the fact that I, haven't practiced sufficiently to learn the Sanskrit characters. So there's really no issue. So that's a kind of trivial instance of it. But in engaging in this second order introspection, right? So metacognition, I'm observing my thoughts. Ultra metacognition, I'm looking at the source of the observation of my own thoughts. This is, a practice which is resonant with and conducive to the states that can be induced through meditative practice. So here what we're doing is looking at reading as a state which is can be complementary to meditative practice, because reading an author such as Philip K. Dick or Aurobindo, for example, Sri Aurobindo Goza, reading writers that tend to encourage our awareness to turn back and look at itself and observe the way it's being affected by a text, it seems to be very efficacious in the pursuit of meditative experience. So that said, is that we can then begin to see that because everybody had some practice to do this week, which is to read, that we can see that reading too is, of course, a practice, and it's a practice of focusing our attention. And just as meditation is the practice of pointing our attention either at our breath or at the source of the meditation itself, depending on the practice that you're engaging in or the tradition you're practicing. So I'm trying to point out a continuum here between this strange contemporary practice of reading, which seems to be both very popular and vanishing at the same time, that the form of attentional discipline that is necessary to actually read one novel in 1 week is not extraordinary, but it is a discipline which is being engaged in sort of less and less. It's not extraordinary to meditate every day either, actually. I haven't looked at the recent numbers, but it looks like I think Americans at least watch something like 39, 40 hours a week of television. And so it should be possible to find an hour every day to meditate. That's just 7 hours a week. You still watch 33 hours of television. And you can watch Buster Friendly for 25 hours a day. So that's just a plug for this idea that we have meditative experience, which is about pointing the attention back onto itself, being on a continuum with reading, and that some authors, such as Philip K. Dick, are particularly conducive to this experience of ultra metacognition. Okay, so why empathy? Well, I thought we could start off by looking, if you don't mind, Jeremy, if you could put up that first Kindle screen from the exegesis, because one of the fascinating things about having access to the exegesis now is that we can look and see, what did PKD think about his books? And of course, in a very funny kind of way, he himself says he doesn't have the last word on his books, in the sense that he himself, he says periodically, did not write the books. Ubik wrote the books, for example. VALIS wrote the books. But it is, undeniably fascinating and important to sort of see the way in which PKD himself reflected on his own books after he had written them. And Ubik is particularly amazing on that score in the exegesis. But Androids actually makes very interesting appearance throughout the exegesis, and I wanted to focus our attention on maybe why. So this is from December 12th, 1981, as you can see, and PKD has sold the text to Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, the movie rights for the making of the film Blade Runner, and Jeremy has a copy of the paperback book that was released, was part of a release through Ballantine that was coincident with the release of this, what turned out to be a blockbuster science fiction film, right? So we have to realize that, up to this point, while Dick was a very prolific writer, he was not making very much money as a writer. He was selling some of his books for $300, $500 back in the day. And, I when I had the opportunity to go to the Fullerton archives many years ago, I was, some of his tax returns were in there, and, he wasn't, it was a difficult life, to make a living as a writer. So to get a fairly large paycheck, I think it was $100,000 for Blade Runner, would in a way, sort of say, wow, you finally made it. You've won all these awards, but, from the kind of perspective of the culture that we live in now, we say, wow, congratulations, PKD, you finally made it. But from his perspective, in this exegesis entry that we're looking at right here, which is from folder 56, that you can look at in more detail on zebrapedia.psu.edu if you're interested. From his perspective, Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, what he just calls androids throughout the exegesis, was really about the importance and the experience of empathy, and in particular the importance and experience of empathy vis-a-vis the ecosystem within which we dwell. Right, as we know, Android's Dream of Electric Sheep takes place, after there's already been something like a nuclear apocalypse. The Earth is not only being slowly covered with kipple, which is PKD's wonderful phrasing to sort of give a physical form to entropy, if you will, but there's dust and there's radiation and there's hardly any human beings left. We get this kind of this radical sense of vacancy that has happened, that everyone has left. And so this idea of the planet slowly becoming uninhabitable, and where a world where living systems are themselves not only at risk, but extraordinarily prized as commodities, shows just like, how extraordinary Dick's, prescience was here, because, he's anticipating a moment where, the very integrity of the ecosystem that is the planet, that is Gaia, is itself at risk. So he seems to have seen the message of Duandre's Dream of Electric Sheep to very much be, about this ecosystemic risk. So he writes, though he seeks to sell his Satan's power fantasies, Blade Runner, he unknowingly promulgates the third kerygma. The ecosphere animal is now ensouled, holy. My God, this movie is the greatest defeat, what was done in the book, and victory, the Tagore kerygma promulgated. The first is ostensible, the latter cryptic. So what I take this to mean is that when he sees the film, right, when he sees the Blade Runner, he sees that it's this kind of, as he'll say further down, a kind of fascist fantasy, right? That these power fantasies of Blade Runner and this sort of space opera. We all can love the movie. It's not a matter of dissing the movie, but you can imagine the experience of a writer who has an understanding, not really even just about the plot or the content of the book, but really what the book was trying to do. What the book was trying to do was induce this experience of compassion, induce this experience of empathy. And when he sees the film, we get this kind of blockbuster, kind of technophilic and technophobic rendition of his vision. And so on the one hand, it's a total defeat, but he decides, in fact, that it's a total victory, because the film is really, from his point of view here, a vector, a means of transmitting the book. He'll say, it is not the victory that people will think the making of a movie from my book is. They will say, it is a great victory to have your book made into one of the biggest movies of all time, but they will not know why. It doesn't have to do with what is in the movie. It has to do with what is in the novel. And he moves on. Now, he mentions the Tagore letter here. The Tagore letter is in the exegesis, and it's a vision that Dick has that is mentioned also in VALIS, of a kind of world teacher or messiah who is manifesting in Sri Lanka, who is a human being who is suffering is experiencing the suffering of the earth itself. From PKD's perspective, this suffering could be understood as a suffering that was being induced by the dumping of radioactive waste. But really, this experience of what I've called elsewhere ecodelia, the ecodelic experience, the experience of realizing and actualizing that one is a biological system enmeshed not only with other individual biological systems, but the biological system itself, Gaia, that we are local instances of a massively interconnected and unified oneness of living systems, and that's the kind of fundamental attribute of living systems, not a kind of accident by the fact that we're all together. One evolutionary unfolding, we can experience that, and when we experience that, one kind of local name for that could be empathy, right? And so while I think it's easy enough to see that if you've read any of the other books like Three Stigmata or Ubik, that there's a kind of panicky feeling associated with this Phil Dickian world, I think one of the distinctive characteristics of Duandre's Dream of Electric Sheep is that it enables us to experience this kind of very deep empathy for Eckerd, the character, for Jack Isidori, the character, for Rachel Rosen, the character, for Iran, the character, and to, in that empathy, in that compassion, to really grasp the empathy handles, if you will, to fuse with, to merge with the struggles that Deckard is going through, the struggles that Isidori is going through, the struggles that Rachel Rosen is going through, the struggles that Pris Stratton and Roy Beatty are going through, the struggles that constitute the life world of this book, right? So Dick has offered us, in a way that Mercer's empathy handles, if you were able to read the book. And in offering us, he's inviting us to not only connect with these characters, but to really fuse with, to become indistinguishable with these characters, to feel what these characters feel. And what these characters feel is this extraordinary loss. We can think about, for example, the feeling that Jack Isidori, this quote-unquote chicken head, a disabled character, a character who both has mad talents and has been impaired by the radiation that has overtaken the planet. And Isidori, as he watches, he's found a spider, if you remember, and the appearance of a spider, is such an extraordinary, epiphany for him, that he's seeing a living thing. It's even dwarfs the experience earlier in the book when he hears the resonance of somebody else's TV booming through the empty apartments, and it's Pris Stratton. He's like, my God, there's another being in here. And that feeling of the yearning for that connection to another being, the feeling of the primordial connection that we have to other beings, both biological and machinic, and we can return to this, but all autopoietic systems with which we feel this deep connection, that when he sees Pris Stratton cutting the legs off of a spider because there's too many of them, because it's redundant, is both, of course, a revelation of the nature of the android mutation, what the nature of an android is in this world, that it has perhaps metacognition, but perhaps not ultra metacognition. There's no who that is identifying with the spider. There's no who that feels the connection to the spider. And as we watch Isidori experience this, we can feel his suffering. We can feel his extraordinary distress. And when we'll open ourselves to that distress, the argument will be tonight that we can discover just a little bit, an inkling of who and what we are, because we discover the unity that we can experience between ourselves and living systems, and between ourselves and other complex systems, right? Large-scale dissipative structures, they can include storms, right? You can include a hurricane, include a tornado, they can include a nor'easter on the eastern seaboard. A large-scale dissipative system would include the internet itself, right? A large-scale dissipative system would be one of these, Nexus 6 models. So if you're interested in this idea of a dissipative structure, dissipative system, you can look to the work of the Belgian Nobel Prize-winning chemist Ilya Prigogine. And the point is that it's a framework that allows us to understand both what is specific about a biological system, but also the way in which other large-scale systems can be dissipative structures and have the sort of complexity that we can feel ourselves connected to and a part of. So from this passage, you can see from the exegesis that Dick was thinking of the release of Durand-Rui's Dream of an Electric Sheep and the widespread publication of it as itself a kind of release of the gospel of empathy, right? Kind of way of getting the transmission out that this was a feeling path. This is a way of interacting with each other and interacting with books, that it's not just a cognitive path. And I want to show you now, if we can go to the first image from Androids there, Jeremy, to the page where they have to dial. If you could zoom in on that a little bit. I don't know. I can go to mine locally, but I don't know if people can see that very well. It's probably the fault of my image. Yeah, that's pretty good. Thank you so much. So if you remember the scene here, and it's interesting how often actually Dick's novels begin with somebody waking up in the morning. When we get to Ubik, we'll feel the struggles of Joe Chip as he tries to find a coin, I believe it's a quarter, for his coffee machine. But it begins, intriguingly, a merry little surge of electricity piped by automatic alarm from the mood organ beside his bed awakened Rick Deckard. Surprised, it always surprised him to find himself awake without prior notice. He rose from the bed, stood up in his multicolored pajamas, and stretched. Dick's the clothing is always interesting. Again, heads up for when we read Ubik, because the sartorial choices in Ubik are remarkable. Now in her bed, his wife Iran opened her gray, unmerry eyes, blinked, then groaned and shut her eyes again. Now, of course, it's worth noting that in this opening passage, this is not on the page you have, but I'm just giving context. In this opening passage, right, that from the very beginning of his day, Rick Deckard is linked to a machine, right? So a merry little surge of electricity piped by automatic alarm from the mood organ beside his bed awakened Rick Deckard, right? So he himself is involved in a kind of reflex arc or circuit with the mood organ itself. Like, in a way, one could say that Deckard is, from the very beginning of the day, an extension of the mood organ. He himself is not really the author of, or the controller, the pilot of the mood organ, but is instead enmeshed with the mood organ. So any idea that we're going to be able to carve a very solid and non-permeable boundary between living systems and machines is, we're disabused of that from the very first sentence, because the surge, the description of the electricity itself is that it's merry, right? It's lively. The historian of science and analyst of science studies, Donna Haraway, who was a teacher of mine, she wrote at one point in an essay called a Manifesto for Cyborgs that that our machines are disturbingly lively, we are surprisingly inert, period. I think it was surprisingly inert, but it was the lively inert binary, and it was the machines that are lively, and we ourselves are inert. So already, back in the day, I think 86 maybe, Manifesto for Cyborgs is kind of announcing the zombie apocalypse, that, that living systems are becoming this kind of, affectively drab beings, and the machines are becoming merry. So PKD is alert that any sort of rigid distinction here between the android and the human is not really going to hold water. It's not just because we don't have a better test than the Voigt-Kampf test. It's because the reality of the situation is that the humans live in a continuum with the technologies with which they're enmeshed, and the technologies live in a continuum with the humans with which they're enmeshed. So this wonderful invention that Dick drops on the first page, the Penfield Mood organ, named, if I recall correctly, for the brain scientist, psychologist Penfield. Maybe it was Roger Penfield, I don't know. Maybe somebody can Google it. He comes up again also in A Scanner Darkly, and I believe he had something to do with the hemispheric qualities of the brain. So merry surge of electricity, they wake up, and the first thing they have to decide, what to do is how to dial, right? So they immediately start having an argument, of course, because of the nature of Deckard's work, and the argument is even over, that he's, killing those poor Andes, as Iran calls them, that, that she's having empathy, sympathy for the androids. So she says, if you dial, this is the bottom of the previous page, Iran said, eyes open and watching, for greater venom, then I'll dial the same. I'll dial the maximum, and you'll see a fight that makes every argument we've had up to now seem like nothing. He sighed, defeated by her threat. I'll dial what's on my schedule for today. Examining the schedule for January 3rd, 1992, he saw that a business-like professional attitude was called for. If I dial by schedule, he said warily, will you agree to also? He waited, canny enough not to commit himself until his wife had agreed to follow suit. My schedule for today lists a 6-hour self-accusatory depression. So what does this have to do with ultra metacognition? Well, what Dick is playing with here in a beautiful conceit is this idea is like, let's just imagine that as opposed to the rather crude pharmacological means that we have access to now, where we're supposed to be able to experience better living through chemistry, or at least serotonin reuptake inhibitors and the like, that you had a kind of endlessly programmable and, remember, metaprogrammable biocomputer with which you interacted that would dial your mood. It begs a question almost immediately, which is, what should I dial? Right? And the question of what you should dial, in other words, what mood should I have? How am I going to program my experience? Immediately puts us in the realm of what John Lilly called metaprogramming the human biocomputer. We have access to programming the human biocomputer. So, I'll dial to give myself more venom so that we're going to have the worst argument you'd ever even imagine. But then that back and forth, that more or less mutual assured destruction that takes place leads to this impasse. So if you look over on the bottom of, I guess that's page 437, they're just arguing back and forth about what to dial. And Deckard says, quote, forget what you've scheduled and I'll forget what I've scheduled. We'll dial a 104 together and both experience it. And then you stay in it while I reset mine from my usual business-like attitude. That way, I'll want to hop up to the roof and check out the sheep and then head out for the office. Meanwhile, I'll know you're not sitting here brooding with no TV. He released her slim, long fingers, passed through the spacious apartment to the living room, which smelled faintly of last night's cigarettes. There he bent to turn on the TV. Again, the TV as this constant presence in the novel of, of course, Buster Friendly, who, as we'll learn, is an android. Dial 888, excuse me, from the bedroom, Orion's voice came. I can't stand TV before breakfast. Dial 888, Rick said as the set warmed. The desire to watch TV, no matter what's on it. And of course, I think we've probably all been in an 888 before. I don't feel like dialing anything at all now, Orion said. Then dial 3, he said. I can't dial a setting that stimulates my cerebral cortex into wanting to dial. If I don't want to dial, I don't want to dial that most of all, because then I will want to dial, and wanting to dial is right now the most alien drive I can imagine. So this is pointing to the level of paradox that can happen on this level, that even when these characters can have more or less total control over the mood that they're going to experience, it begs the question of what the higher level is, what the ultra meta-abstraction, metacognition level is that will decide what it wants to be. What is it? Who is it? Who is Iran? I just want to sit here on the bed and stare at the floor. So this impasse of not knowing what to dial is kind of dwelled in a depressive state. It's basically a radical depression. And so she's experiencing this radical depression. And in that radical depression, our own kind of empathy is summoned, is solicited. Because the depression, of course, as Deckard will say, goes against the very nature of the mood organ, but it also points to something that transcends the mood organ. It points to this quest that Iran is having for who she is and for what she is, and finding some sense of, dare I say it, meaning that leaps beyond what, the rational, mind can point to, and instead comes from that place, that same place, when she already is having compassion for, quote, those poor Andes, right? So compassion here empathy here is treated as a way of transcending the impasses of mere metacognition. And if we think about that, it makes sense, because if we'll practice radical empathy, if we'll let go of the barrier between ourselves and another being, in the letting go of that barrier, then there's that, again, that kind of grasping of the empathy handles. There is a fusion where the question of who wants to dial 8 right now, or who wants to watch TV no matter what is on, becomes a quest to find that which is behind all this desiring or not desiring to dial. It becomes a site of radical introspection. By melting into the other, we resolve the paradox of metacognition and experience ultra metacognition. So rather than the logical contradictions of not knowing what to dial being solved on the level of logic, what the rest of the novel is pointing to is that these paradoxes can be solved through the kind of dissolving power of love, and radical intentional love that is experienced akin to what Dick will talk about in the exegesis as, quote, agape, the Greek word for a love that is totally devoid of any kind of self-interest. So maybe this is a good moment to pause and see what kind of questions this initial foray into the opening pages produces in everybody. Just again, the kind of bullet point would be that the novel is, among other things, a kind of training in our experience of radical empathy, becoming aware of our experience of radical empathy, and that it's pointing to the fact that if we'll practice radical empathy, that the impasses of the purely logical plane of existence that is constituted by consumption and the pursuit of self-interest can be dissolved, because they are themselves a product of our experience of our separation from each other, which then becomes illusory when we experience this form of fusion.
Awesome, Rich. So we do have quite a few comments and questions tonight. So this one's from Dan, and Dan's making the observation that in androids, there's such a dysfunctional break between the inner needs of the characters and their external environment. Dick sees a future in which technology, the mood organ, allows the characters to achieve the balance between these things that they can achieve through their minds. Did Dick believe that technology always stunted human consciousness in this way, or is it a distinctive trait of the particularly extreme dystopia in androids?
Thanks, Dan. That's a really great question and very well put. I would say, based on, again, the reflections that PKD engages in on androids in the exegesis, I would say that it's not so much a quality of technology as always being the stunting of human growth, but that it's essentially, what Buddhism and Hinduism both will call samsara. That there is this kind of, that, as you put it nicely, Dan, human beings, there's this mismatch between our internal needs and our external needs. And the characters are spending their times endlessly trying to satisfy their external needs, because they're under the impression, if they satisfy their external needs, if I could just get a freaking ostrich, then their internal needs will be satisfied. But in fact, the problem is that you can't get there from here. That even with the Penfield Mood organ, it's not possible to satisfy your internal needs because you don't know what they are, right? You haven't inquired into the nature of who you are. So all you're going to do is program what's already been programmed for you. And so in that sense, what's called for, and I think what reason why in a lot of ways, I mean, Dick is he's obviously a very Christian writer, but he's also a very Buddhist writer, is that this suffering, which doesn't change very much in a technological regime. In other words, we just have a new form of suffering with different technologies. Like we're still having the cliched husband and wife argument upon awakening. But what happens is that the suffering, the distress, because it's not solved by the technology, right? The technology promises to solve it, but cannot. And because eventually we may experience that it cannot solve it, and that solicits us into making a turn within and looking within and finding the space in which we can at least grapple with it, if not solve it. But I like that very much. I think it's a very good guideline in thinking about this, the mismatch between the internal needs of the characters and the external needs of the characters, which is, of course, one of the reasons why we probably resonate with PKD's characters so much. I mean, we're living in one of the most materially gifted societies in the history of the planet, and we have an epidemic of depression. We have an epidemic of opioids and other addictions, and those are really just scratching the surface of the general dis-ease and malaise that these mismatch between the internal needs that we have and our attempt to satisfy those internal needs externally.
Yeah, there's an interesting, I mean, that kind of comment was very interesting because I was just thinking about how a lot of techno-utopians from the 90s and even early mid-2000s about social media revolution were, heralding this is going to transform consciousness. And here we are kind of with the infighting and the Facebook problem and Zuckerberg saying that Facebook it's broken. So here we are, our technologies are failing to deliver the externalization of our salvation, right? And now we're kind of in that period where we're looking back inward again and going, what do we do? So it's just kind of an interesting connection there with the present. But Erica was...
And I think if we look, I think it's a great comment, Jeremy, because I think if we look historically at where, web culture, internet culture came from before it was consolidated into the big social media sites, there's a very big difference. In the early web culture, it was possible to dissolve into another character. It was possible to dissolve into anonymity. And the kind of data mining operations that get launched with Google and Facebook and other social media platforms that you're discussing make that anonymity impossible. So rather than dissolving the egoic boundary that a lot of people were experiencing, right? Timothy Leary wrote some very interesting books on information technology. He was doing research on virtual reality at Penn State, in fact, towards the end of his life. So I think it has everything to do with the way in which the information architecture, as Dick might put it, replicated the empire that never ended. In other words, that we had this opportunity, we had this opening into this new medium that was both instigated to a great extent by psychedelic culture and inhabited as a kind of psychedelic technology because it was an expansive space. It was a place where you could experiment with not having an identity at all. But then when it got consolidated into the need that capitalism has for each of us to have an identity so that we can buy and sell things and so that our data can be bought and sold, then we see that we get kind of shoehorned back into this constricted form of identity that is totally at odds with the digital domain, with the digital ecosystem. So it feels like what's happening, like a couple of years ago, I was thinking about this as like digital crucifixion, that we kind of oscillate between being completely smithereened by the flows of information that we're constantly solicited into, responding to, so much so that our attention span, and I'm not just like bemoaning this, but literally we can observe that our attention span for a news cycle, for example, just has radically dwindled, So that we oscillate between that and just this kind of, wow, this is all one big interconnected, self-regulating cybernetic mess that is coming into some sort of awareness. And the current president has received more media attention, more information, I would opine, I would hypothesize, has been connected to that person. The etymology of whose name means fake. Okay, fake. It would be a very Phildickian name. That has gotten more media than God, right? That there's been more information exchanged about this arrest of the informational flow that we experience, all into the same story, right? We must all follow the same story. Is that kind of like being torn to pieces? On the one hand, we feel how expansive the medium is, and how, in fact, our identity can dissolve in this medium. We can experiment with being all different ways of being through this medium, and yet we constantly get, again, shoehorned back into that identity. So that the space is still there, and I think that's one of the interesting things that we're trying to do here. That, in fact, we're all kind of walking up the hill with Mercer here. We're forming a kind of collective that isn't, simply an exchange of information between individuals and equals, but is instead the collective of the formation of some sort of a collective where we lose our own identities momentarily.
So this question from Erica was just riffing on your point. She was saying, hey Mobius, great point about reading affecting us differently every time. The book terrified me this time until metacognitively fusing with Mercer through the characters' journeys. Electric Sheep is an animal and future androids' rights manifesto. Do you think androids will idolize PKD as their savior, leading to the revolution?
That's funny. I just want to process that. Well, first of all, nobody ever worships the right being, so probably no, right? But I do think that this is a really interesting moment. Like, so I was involved in some of the early, publications on artificial life in the late '80s, and when people were using evolutionary techniques to breed computer code, essentially. There were simulations of life which were so lifelike that somebody like a scientist, Tom Ray, who created one of the first artificial life programs called Tierra, said it wasn't lifelike, it was alive, right, for all working purposes. And that they were exploring the space of life, not life as it is, but life as it could be, life in silico. Now that's a really interesting moment, and it has its own, kind of questions that we could look into, but it kind of replicates some of the stuff that Dick was up to, because there's this issue of, at what point is a machinic a machinic entity, does it have some purchase on us ethically, basically? And there were almost immediately essays about, the ethics of artificial life forms. But what I find is so interesting about this is that there's this kind of premise in the field of a lot of ethics, not so much, like metaphysical philosophy and ethics, but sort of contemporary bioethics, for example, if you look at it, that there's this idea that there's a solution, that that rights are something that can be, like, say, that we could give to machines because it's worked so well with human beings, right? In other words, like we create this fiction that a state or a government or a corporation or what have you has these things called rights that it could give to a human being. And then we decide, like, what segment of human beings are going to get those rights. And then we decide that maybe something else should get those rights, like animals or plants. Like, there's a wonderful text from Switzerland about, the rights of and the rights and dignity of plants. Now, I respect all of those things because plants are, extraordinary beings, and we ought to tune our awareness towards them and towards animals and towards each other and towards bacteria. But this idea that like we're going to somehow be able to give rights to things is odd, because it hasn't really worked out from the 18th century, right? You know, that this idea that somehow human beings were going to be able to create institutions that gives rights to things. Instead, what we get are, you know, power differentials of relations. So it may be that, you know, if the AIs, you know, when the AIs are kind of, you know, usurp the corporations. I mean, corporations are already essentially AIs that operate according to algorithmic rules that are not really subject to the agency of any human being. So this weird idea we have that like when the AIs take over, it's like, well, the AIs will be the instantiation of corporations in computer models, and they haven't really taken over. They just have the pretense to power. And yes, they have extraordinary power, but they haven't taken over. You know, the empire never ended, but we're still here. Biological systems are still going. So I just think that the future is likely to be a deeply biological one. So I think if anything, the AIs would recognize the extraordinary beauty and complexity and fecundity of living systems, and that would be what they would revere. They wouldn't revere themselves. They would revere the Gaian substrate that makes them possible. They're a kind of sprouting out of a already living sentient entity that can then recognize, if you'll forgive me, its mother. But I think PKD will be revered for a long time, not just by androids, but by human beings, as kind of really identifying an impasse in human evolution that we're being called upon to transcend. And that impasse is, in this book anyway, best addressed through empathy.
Yeah, there's, before I chime in with one more comment from Dan, It is interesting. I was noticing this as we were rereading it, that the beginning, when they're working with the mood organ, humans are more like machines. To be able to meta-program what are your psychological narratives today? Oh, depression, self-loathing, all business. Like, I have it all set. I'm going to go through my psychological routine. I've got it programmed. We're becoming more android-like as we are searching for living beings and revering living beings. So there's a kind of loop that we're talking about here between synthetic and real and biological and human is just kind of spinning around. It's interesting.
But here's the weird human symptom, though, that then persists, because I totally agree. From the very beginning, we really can't draw the boundary between human and machine, which is why Iran feels that compassion and why Deckard is annoyed by that compassion, because he knows that there's something to it, right? But there's this program that we're still running on as humans in the book, and that program is sacrifice. That we generate, that the way in which we know what we are as humans is by scapegoating another and even killing another, right? And so in that context, then, the termination of the Andes is in fact this repetition of one of the oldest human practices there is, which is the sacrifice of the other, and the experience of guilt before the sacrifice of the other, which then creates this sense of isolation and, you know, quote unquote individuality, as opposed to uniqueness, right? We feel separate, alone, and afraid, and because otherwise, you know, it's kind of interesting how poorly developed the idea that these Andes need to be retired in the first place is. Like, well, okay, but why do they need to be removed? They're hiding together in this building, right? But it's clearly, I think, from PKD, from the novel's perspective, to maintain this distinction between the human and the machine, even though it's purely a cultural distinction wrought by sacrifice.
Yeah, it's interesting that the new movie did that too. I don't know if you got a chance to see
I haven't seen it yet. No, it almost got me to watch it the other night.
It's in the trailer. One of the characters is saying there's a wall and we can't cross that wall between, replicants and humans, and, not giving any plot points away, but that was in the trailer. So again, is this the need to keep that boundary up in order to maintain our definition of what life is and what selfhood is. So,
and it's licensed by this idea of identity, right? And so there's an interesting tension there in terms of our contemporary politics, where, right and left are kind of oriented around identity. So the alt-right is identity politics for the right. So this impasse that we're at, where instead of inquiring into what the source of identity is something that we have, right? So to me, that is an impasse that asks us to go beyond the recognition of identity and towards, again, MLK, one of MLK's favorite words, agape. It's all over his theology. It's all over his methodology that, the last big political mutation that we made, where we recognized, the possibility that we're actually connected in ways in which we couldn't allow before, happened through agape, not through the expansion of an identity franchise to other people, right? Let's be beyond identity, I think is Androids is saying. Where does Rick Deckard begin and the mood organ end?
That's a good question. It's interesting because Dan's saying this too, and the environment in the book has been so deeply poisoned, it's difficult to see characters coping with it without their technology. If they did find the inspiration to reject it, the resulting existential crisis would be so extreme that depression seems more likely than an evolution of consciousness. I think he's saying, how do you, the world in this novel has become so toxic that you need that. Now you need the technological mediation in which to survive and flourish and thrive, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a kind of...
I don't know, though. Think about the Jack Isidori character. He's kind of the dropout from, the technological society, because he has these mad talents and these impasses. And remember, on the one hand, he doesn't, there's that beautiful, maybe we should look at, did I share the Airsat's cat death page with you? I think I did. It doesn't matter.
Let's take a look.
Would be...
That's on 5:30.
Let's just leave it there for now. We'll talk about Luba Luft in a minute. But I actually think that Jack Isidori, but also in this scene with Deckard, that it really is in the... I agree. It's like incredibly toxic when Deckard is out and he finds the frog, or the toad, excuse me, that, it really is on the edge of like being impossible to experience, Emerson's nature. You can't go out into nature and dissolve into it. So you have to find other means of dissolving. But I think that this is maybe a good transition to move on to Luba Luft. This scene with Luba Luft, the opera singer, really points to this experience of dialogue, that in fact dialogue between human beings, and actually between human beings and androids, is actually this domain where something besides depression seems to exist. So Rick has, of course, already been taken to the fake police station in the Mission District and gone through that. We can discuss that. But now he's out to get Luba, to retire Luba Luft again. And he says, After a pause, Rick said to the clerk, a heavy-jowled, middle-aged woman with netted gray hair, do you have a copy of Munch's Puberty? Because first, of course, we see we're given a description of Munch's The Scream, right, as art, as this domain, Dan, for the participants, whether they be android or human, to actually find something beyond depression. You know, that we, like, obviously nothing could be more visually emblematic of, you know, angst or, you know, depression. It's slightly different than Munch's The Scream, but they're in the art museum, and Luba Luft clearly likes the image and asks if she'll buy it, and says, do you have a copy of Munch's Puberty? Only in this book of his collected works, the clerk said, lifting down a handsome glossy volume, perhaps released by Revolver Press. $25. I'll take it. He reached for his wallet. Phil Resch said, my departmental budget could never in a million years be stretched. My own money, Rick said. He handed the woman the bills and Luba the book. Now let's get started down. So there's this moment when Deckard is engaging in this totally selfless act towards an android. And he said, and she responds in kind. She says, it's very nice of you, Luba said as they entered the elevator. There's something very strange and touching about humans. An android would never have done that. She glanced icily at Phil Resch. It wouldn't have occurred to him, as he said, never in a million years. She continued to gaze at Resch, now with manifold hostility and aversion. I really don't like androids. Ever since I got here from Mars, my life has consisted of imitating the human, doing what she would do, acting as if I had the thoughts and impulses a human would have, imitating, as far as I'm concerned, a superior life form. To Phil Resch, she said, isn't that how it's been with you, Resch, trying to be... So he can't handle it because he's being toyed with as, you know, a possible android. And now if we look over on the next page, Deckard does something very interesting. And I can't quite see it there because it's blocked by an icon, but I can find it. What, you know, can you see the page number there so I can look it up here?
Yeah, let's see. It's 531.
531. With his laser, he's just killed Luba Luft. He said, with his laser tube, Rick systematically burned into blurred ash the book of pictures which he had just a few minutes ago bought Luba. He did the job thoroughly, saying nothing. Phil Resch watched without understanding, his face showing his perplexity. You could have kept the book yourself, Resch said, when it had been done. That cost you... Do you think androids have souls? Rick interrupted. So what is this moment, right? This moment is an exchange, but an exchange with no agenda. It's an episode of Agape by Deckard, who is giving this gift, a gift which is itself about, you know, an artist who is attempting to somehow fathom and plumb the depths of, you know, this human experience of loss and depression. And Deckard burns the book. And he does it thoroughly. And I'm, you know, wondering what people think. Why? Why did he burn the book?
Yeah, feel free to step on in, folks. But I had, let's see, this is from Erica mentioning something interesting here in this scene. It was evidence of his compassion. He's conflicted, she says.
For sure. But how does the burning of the book, you know, he's sacrificing the book, isn't he? You know, he's showing that there's absolutely no holding back on the agape, right? If he bought the book and then he kept it, he really would have been purchasing it for himself, right? It would have, retroactively undone the giving of the gift, the giving of himself, this act of radical empathy. Right? And he's certainly conflicted. But by incinerating the book, by destroying this act of destruction, he actually makes pure that giving of the gift. Right? The gift will now always have been a gift. There was no possible ulterior motive on the gift. It was a pure giving from his perspective, a pure donation, if you will. So that's just a long way of getting back to Dan's question. Like, well, what are they going to do? Because they're trapped in this toxic world and they've got nothing but technology to sustain them. Well, they have art and they have the destruction of art, and they have dialogue. And it really does seem that what matters is not so much, is Luba-Luft an android or not, but is there the capacity for this dialogue here that recognizes when it occurs this gesture of empathy, this gesture of agape. And I think that's what's really interesting, is that Luba-Luft notices it. She understands it, whereas Resch does not, right? She says it's odd. She says there's something very strange and touching. But that touching part means that she feels it. It's not simply this does not compute, like why you do that, right? It's a beautiful gesture before she's killed, right? Something like a aesthetic Last Supper.
Yeah, it's almost like, how anthropologists look for evidence of human culture and they go, well, Neanderthals buried their dead. There's symbolic meaning in the loss. And by Deckard doing this, by burning the book, there's a kind of symbolic meaning and a mourning, yes. In its purest, giving somebody who's no longer, who has passed on, even if he's responsible for it, this kind of, just a symbol of empathy.
Exactly. So, do you remember, or are you old enough to remember Tamagotchi?
Yeah, I remember.
Okay, so there was and is, I hope still, a cemetery, I believe it was in Ireland, where you could send your Tamagotchi to be buried when it died, right? This, and I really think that there is this, as you're pointing out, this kind of anthropological incorporation of, you mentioned Latour last week, non-human actants into the field of meaning. Like one of the reasons, we experience other human beings having meaning is because they're unique lives that they're living unto death, just like we are. And every death, we experience the fact that every death has meaning. Whether or not we love that person or not, we experience that every death has meaning. Now, of course, when we scale up, we don't experience that every death has meaning, and that's worth meditating on. But as a human being, if we interact with anybody as a human being, barring some very marginal cases that are outside the sort of, that haven't evolved according to the Darwinian strictures of evolving into this kind of sense of reciprocal altruism at the very least, then we experience their uniqueness in that loss, and we start to extend that experience. We start to spread the meaning more widely. And so, and theoretically, there's no limit to what we could find meaningful. We of course we find the life of a plant meaningful. Of course we find the life. That doesn't mean that we just go around in mourning all the time. It means that we experience our interconnection with those living things. So I feel like that's the only way that planet could come back, is by bootstrapping itself off of the meaning to be found in the interaction between these entities that are capable of acts of agape, acts of the squandering of enormous amounts of resources for the benefit of another.
Yeah, Warren was saying that could it be also that the burning of the book was Rick's attempt to remove the connection that he had with Luba, to distance himself?
It could be. That's not what I felt when I read it, but you're quite right. But then we wonder why he would say do you think androids have souls? I guess, again, yeah, it still works, doesn't it? Because then it would be this sense of like trying to remove the evidence because he killed her, and he doesn't want anything reminding him of her. But either way, right, it shows that he's engaged in this relationship of meaning with Lou Beloved. And, a lot of times we focus on the relationship, understandably, with Rachel Rosen because it's an erotic relationship. But already Deckard is involved in this relationship with Lou Beloved, which is one of a kind of mutual recognition, let's say, mutual recognition that of the compassion for the other. So, but good insight, Warren. I think that could be, particularly given, the when Rachel will kill, the goat, which of course is a goat, right? It's a scapegoat. She's sacrificing the goat. This could be seen as a kind of sacrifice and a kind of desire to remove the other, to remove any evidence of the other. It's not how I took it this time.
This is an interesting question from Joseph about this. What would panpsychists say to do androids have souls?
There's only one soul. and all of us have it. That there's one soul out of which all beings. I'm sure there are quite many different positions on panpsychism as philosophers. But if you go back to sort of Plotinus, and you think about the one, I think the formulation of like an entity having a soul is a little bit weird, because what we're talking about here is a sentience that is immanent to the whole universe, right? It's not something which is located here, located there. It's not that Jeremy has a soul and it's some kind of island in a universe of void, otherwise inert universe. No, Jeremy is a manifestation of a universe that is already ensouled, and that Jeremy is a sign of the fact that the universe is ensouled. And so we can observe that the universe is ensouled by interacting with Jeremy or interacting with Warren or interacting with Lindsay, and seeing each other and seeing living systems as evidence for that ensoulment of the universe. Does that make sense?
I think so. For me, it does. We're not monads, just islands of spiritual numinosity floating around, disconnected. So Marston's saying, the burning of the book may be connected with the fact that Deckard wanted to be tested by the empathy test. He felt guilty for his lack of compassion and empathy to humans, and I guess to the androids, which he tries to replace with the love of the living animal, pretending to be real is what moves the story. Yeah, it's interesting, that the idea that a bounty hunter who destroys machines, living machines that show at least they act as if they are trying to preserve themselves and therefore are worthy of empathy, is sort of redirected towards a fake animal or a living animal, and the curation of these very beautiful creatures that we try to preserve and value now. I don't know, maybe it's like a way to kind of to compensate for that guilt of sort of being
but the fact that he has the guilt, right, is a sign of the compassion, which then can, like, the solution to the guilt is to experience the empathy, right? It's only because we feel ourselves these monads, as you put it. Like, guilt only lives in a separate being. It's only if you can feel yourself as separate that you feel guilty. If you learn to wither that boundary, make it a permeable membrane, and see yourself as participating in a dynamic unfolding, a flow, then the idea of guilt is a little bit odd, because where is the isolated entity where the guilt would stick, as it were? Who would have the guilt? So this is a little bit like what Timothy Leary will call in High Priest, being hurled out of the good and evil game, right? That good and evil only makes sense insofar as we agree to stand still to be identities that can be guilty or not guilty. And this is what's going to happen to Barney Mayerson in the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. And intriguingly, his solution is to practice atonement, which of course is at one-ment. He needs to become one, as Julian of Norwich would call it, one with his fellow human, one with the universe. So, but I think that's a good insight that there's this guilt that occurs because he's not at these moments he has not fused with Mercer.
Yes, and I'd just like to mention, I see some people are on the Facebook chat. We're paying attention to the Facebook chat as well, the live stream. So if you have a question, I see Marston had a few in there. Please type that in. I will catch that for you. So, Lindsay's saying, oh yeah, their androids are made with the intention to appear as though they have empathy.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And Don is talking about, this is an interesting question too, but this kind of goes into why maybe Philip K. Dick wrote the androids as beings you want to empathize with, but also as beings that not in every case, but like with Pris tearing the limbs off of the spider, that they don't have the empathy at the same time as they are beings worthy of empathy. They're kind of wrestling with a very human trait of losing empathy for other organisms too. So I would probably kind of flip that around and say, like, maybe that is why they are more like us, because they're just as capable of shutting that off sometimes as well. Don't know.
No, there's a great essay that is in the Selected Literary and Philosophical Writings and is then also available on the web, or it was last I checked. If you Google it, Man, Android, and Machine, where Dick really kind of grapples with this, because you're quite right. There isn't really a clear-cut view that he has that about the relationship between the human and the android. That's what makes it interesting. When Pris is cutting the legs off of the spider, we've been set up in a way to empathize with the androids, a la Iran. But then it's hard to take the killing of the cutting of the legs of the spider, anticipating a book, a moment in the book Scanner Darkly, when there's a neighbor, I believe it's a spider. I think it's another spider. And she says, if I'd known it were harmless, I would have killed it myself, period. Right? So to buttress your idea, Jeremy, that it's not so much like, is it a human or an android that is devoid of empathy, but that a kind of generalized dwindling capacity for empathy that is happening irregardless of the kind of autopoietic system that is hosting it. That periodically Deckard can kind of overcome his compassion, which he then, in order to retire a few Andes, and then he'll take the money and directly go and make a deposit, on a beautiful goat, right, to as recompense, for that he's buried or sublimated, as we used to say, his empathy for the Andes, and now he can reinvigorate his empathy through his interaction with the goat.
Yeah, there's a kind of economy of
yes.
empathy here,
yes.
in the value of organism, a perceived value of an organism, and a redistribution of that empathy towards other organisms, which just really is kind of an interesting way of thinking about what we do, in the world as an actuality. So
well, and again, that is happening now, because now empathy is a positive brand attribute, right? So, I'm sure Mark Zuckerberg has personal feelings about the poison that Facebook has become, but I think it's also that there's a brand problem, that everybody is feeling this kind of panicky info space that is composed by Facebook and Twitter and the like, and there's a kind of recognition that something weird has happened, something not necessarily, benevolent has happened, and that we're kind of involved in these pitched battles of affect wars with each other all across the planet, and that maybe we can transcend that in some way. So now cue mindfulness, right, training to come in there so Aetna Corporation can bring mindfulness to your large-scale organization in order to help manage the bad effects of these affective wars of people having internal self-referential narrative going all day long. That is about some demonized other, right? So again, incredibly prescient to recognize that, hey, deep down, I mean, if you read the exegesis, Dick does affirm and believe in empathy as a core value of what it means to not only be a human being, but of being a biological entity, right? But, there's no limit to the ability of the empire, as it were, to take what is a beautiful attribute of human beings and figure out how to commodify it, right? Which is why the constant recourse to the Sidney's catalog, the well-thumbed copy of the Sidney's catalog is such a, hilarious. It's an automatic gesture. It's a kind of reflex that really what's happening is that, as you're saying, there's an economy, there's a capturing of the surplus value of a living form as, so he has to kill some machines so that he can afford some life,
Yeah. Great. So I don't know, Rich, if you wanted to take a couple of more of these slides before we run out of time.
Yeah, let's go to the next one just so we can get some good PKD words in our noggin. That one is 3. Let's see.
488.
Right. Going back, I think, to Isidori here.
Mm-hmm.
I just love Isidori, so just indulge me. I remember driving around the area near San Francisco State in San Francisco, and there's a Sloat Avenue, and Dick was kind of informed by that word there. So, yes, here, this is perfect, apropos what we were just talking about. Over on the left-hand side, the third passage here where it says, our minds, Isidori decided, they're fighting for control of our psychic selves. The empathy box on the one hand, Buster's guffaws and off-the-cuff jibes on the other. I'll have to tell Hannibal Sloat that, he decided. Ask him if it's true. He'll know, right? So, again, what's being described here is an attention economy, right? That on the one hand, you have Mercerism, you have the empathy box, which is a vector towards fusion. And then on the other hand, you have the Buster Friendly show, which is a kind of sardonic, critique of empathy, that empathy is something to be avoided. It's nothing interesting, nothing worth doing. Move on. No need to fuse, with your fellow being. And I think that's a really fantastic passage to meditate on in terms of where we are right now, right? Whereas we're, the overwhelming telos of the mediascape right now is asking, it's all Buster friendly. It's Buster from the left, it's Buster from the right. It's not this, the reverence for the non-dual state just really isn't there. So that's where I wanted to then move on to the next one, because even Roy Blatty, I think this is the one that I called Roy Blatty non-dual fool, Jeremy.
Let's see. Sorry, just trying to get to the next page here.
No problemo.
Here we go.
Yeah, so if you could zoom in on that middle block quote there. Okay, so Roy Batty, the poop sheep informed him. The poop sheet informed him. Has an aggressive, assertive air of ersatz authority. Given to mystical preoccupations, this android proposed the group escape attempt, underwriting it ideologically with pretentious fiction as to the sacredness of so-called android life. In addition, this android stole and experimented with various mind-fusing drugs, claiming when caught that it hoped to promote in androids a group experience similar to that of Mercerism, which it pointed out remains unavailable to androids. So to me, very interesting that the impetus to freedom here by Roy Batty, the pull, because we could ask, like, well, why do the androids seek to escape? You know, they're machines. Why this will to transcend? And the will to transcend comes from the search for this state, for the search for this non-dual state, this state that we can experience when we go to ultra meta-cognition, when we're not simply a separate being observing our own awareness, but when we look back at our own awareness and can feel ourselves dissolve into, you know, the universe itself. We can feel that the universe is thinking these things through us, which is an experience that Dick had very often. So the kind of non-dual quarry of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is shared by both androids and humans, that where they were trying to get to, the quest was all about the experience of this non-dual state, where empathy, of course, is the sign of the possibility of experiencing that non-dual state, but whose means can vary, can be anything from the empathy handles to mind-fusing drugs to a novel. So that's where I wanted to lead everybody, or at least point everybody in the direction of tonight, in the sense that if we'll experiment with the possibility of dissolving ourselves into another, the possibility of dissolving ourselves into the universe, and the possibility of experiencing this kind of Dionysian non-dual state that we can even experience while we're reading, the experience of deep immersive reading is that experience of the dissolution of the self, then, you know, I think that we're really receiving, you know, what PKD called, you know, the kernel teachings that were being distributed by Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And in so doing, we kind of keep the book alive, that the book doesn't get covered over by this kind of technological sheen of what we think Philip K. Dick is up to. By now, we think we know what the Phil Dickian experience is, right? There's too many movies and shows even to have seen, but in PKD's own experience, that at least when it came to Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and Blade Runner, that it was really all about the other media are being used to propagate the books. And so this experience of reading and this experience of sharing the reading that we're doing right now, and sharing our insights, sharing the perspective and the different angles on the book and our experiences of the book, that really is that kind of, you know, grasping at the empathy handles that I think PKD was pointing to there. That, because it's a way of making sense of why doesn't it matter that Mercer is, quote, a hoax. It's because Mercer is a fiction. But in the domain of fiction, we can leave behind this other domain of fiction, which is this domain of the I, this ultimate fiction where we believe that we're somehow actually separate from each other. And in fact, let go of that separation and experience not only the melding with characters, but the melding with each other.
So, yeah, I was going to ask you actually touch on this about the end of that chapter, the chapter in my book, it's like chapter 18 with the spider.
Yeah.
And he's, you know, on the television, but they're revealing that the whole thing was a fake, right? Oh, you could see the sky is painted, and Roy and Pris are like, oh, you know, he's upset about Mercer. Then he goes, and it's kind of interesting how Philip K. Dick writes this. And yes. That I don't remember him grabbing the handles
No.
It just kind of got swept up into this vision, this
Yep.
kind of visionary state, a few pages of the world kind of falling apart, and he touches the wall and it collapses, and the chair falls apart, and suddenly reality starts falling apart, and he's in this dark night, and he calls out to Mercer, and Mercer appears, and he's like, yeah, I told him everything, I'm a fake, it's true. Everything they said on the TV is true. But it's not going to stop people from following me. And that's the point. And I think that was an interesting statement. He says something to that degree, that they're not going to, Mercerism is going to go away, and the androids don't understand that because they're still on that quest for empathy. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And I was going to ask what you thought of after he says, I am a fraud. They're sincere. They're researchers genuine. And then he goes, it's true. They did a good job from their standpoint. And they will have trouble understanding why nothing has changed, because you're still here and I'm still here. And then Mercer indicated with a sweep of his hand the barren rising hillside, the familiar place. I lifted you from the tomb world just now, and I will continue to lift you until you lose interest and want to quit. But you will have to stop searching for me, because I will never stop searching for you. I just thought that was really interesting. What did you think? What did you think Mercer meant by that?
Well, the analogy I would go to is, remember, again, this John Lilly framework of programming and metaprogramming the human biocomputer, right? So one of the things that Lilly discovered in going into a flotation tank under the influence of LSD-25 is that if he used different scripts, he experienced different states. And one of the scripts he liked to use was the idea that Star Maker that there is this Olaf Stapleton VALIS-like God entity, and he'll proceed according to that premise. And he totally bracketed whether or not that premise was true or false. He just said, he called it the as if true. And in pursuing the as if true, he had extraordinary experiences that he could not have if he had not hypothesized the existence of the Star Maker. So same thing here. It's like, fine, okay, Mercer is fiction, right? But if we treat that fiction as if true, we discover aspects of ourselves that are true. It is true that we are more expansive beings than we think we are. The means, or, like upaya, they call it in the Buddhist tradition, right? They're skillful means. The means by which we get there are themselves an artifact. They're not, the truth. But what we can experience using these fictional means is true. And that's why Mercerism will not stop. Like, non-duality is real. Mercer is not. Make sense? Right. And so I was at a virtual reality conference a couple months ago where they were like looking at how to develop maps. And I was thinking about that as I was reading Mercerism again, because here you've got this VR app for experiencing this non-dual fusion. And over again, what we talked about is that, well, the reason it works is because it, with the suffering, it makes us go into ourselves. It makes us go into, what Heidegger called our own most, right? It has to be our suffering, right? So I think that we ought not be surprised that, no particular framework that is going to teach us how to reach ultra metacognition is itself true, because it's part of the conceptual realm. So it can only be a kind of map of a way to arrive at the truth. But that it itself is not true does not dissuade, does not have anything to do with the fact of whether or not ultra metacognition is actual, is real, is true. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's interesting how much, and again, you're always finding these interesting things about Philip K. Dick and his ideas, specifically about religion.
Yes.
I mean, real and fake is such a thematic literary device he's always using and exploring, all the way up to, the ultimate questions about reality. Are they real and fake? God, real and fake? But he's kind of arguing for a participatory vision, like what Jorge Ferrer talks about from CIS. So this kind of, there's a participation we have with ultimate, integral consciousness, divine reality, where we have to use the as if you have to use the as if. There's no other way around it. There's this kind of intermediary space where those things are necessary. You kind of have to extend yourself out there with an as if system to experience the hyper real, the more real than the reality that could be a videotape, that could be a fake prophet, that could be ABC, virtual reality, whatever, take your pick. There's a higher reality or a greater reality in that. And it almost needs the fake. It needs you to kind of fake it until I don't want to use that fake it till you make it, but
yeah,
there's an element, there's an element of participation, which I think is interesting. And here he is writing about this, 1968. So I think that's pretty fascinating.
Well, and I totally agree. And it's very interesting. What does that as if gesture consist of? And it's almost, we can think of it as being overly credulous, but I don't think it is. I think it's about relaxing our need for certainty. It's about relaxing our sense that we know. It's about not knowing. It's about experimenting. And so if we'll experiment with these concepts that point beyond concepts, then and that participation, as you nicely put it, can take place. Now, the other thing that's in the background here, of course, is that we'll get to also in a way in Three Stigmata, is that what's happening at this period of time, there's a lot of controversy, of course, over these, mind-fusing drugs, right? People are saying, can, LSD obviously, or psilocybin can induce states in which we have experienced, many, myself included, report the experience of the divine, right? And so then there's this kind of argument of like, well, is that, the real divine, or is that just a fake state induced by, a chemical? But there's different kind of presuppositions that go along there. The idea I think is worth pointing to is this idea that it's not so much that a psychedelic or a book is inducing the state, or that Mercer is inducing the state, is that they're blocking the false state, right? That you're using this fictional or technological means for blocking the false state. And when you block the false state, you can experience what the Buddhist tradition calls in Sanskrit, amithyatvad, which means true by virtue of not being false. It's basically what's left when you get rid of the false. So, this worry we have over like what means are legitimate is like really feels to me, again, as a kind of, argument over totem, whose totem is right, who has the right path, the non-duality. The answer is all of us do, but we have to practice, we have to participate in that path, as you put it. And that when we participate, it means letting down our demand for certainty, going with the possibility of an as if, going with the possibility of something transcending our consciousness.
So, yes to all of that. And if anybody has any more questions, I know we're kind of at a little over the 90-minute mark now. Maybe we'd want to cover, Rich, you want to cover the last slide, and then we can take one or two more questions?
For sure.
Okay, great. Let me switch to that. Okay.
Let's see.
Trying to make that as large as I can.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. This is Mercer. I'm sorry. Can you tell me what page that says it is?
Yeah, 560.
Yeah. And this can really, I think this can help us because, when we see Deckard's trials and, climbing the hill, when we see the others climbing the hill, we can identify with our own kind of real kind of pilgrimage that we're on here, our own quest that, our own quest for ultra metacognition, our own quest for a non-dual state. And we can feel ourselves torn to pieces by the competing and paradoxical demands that we experience on the level of just metacognition. So I thought that the response here, Mercer's response here is beautiful. So I'll just read a bit from the middle of the page on the right-hand side. A man stood before him, a sorrowful light in his weary, pain-drenched eyes. So, Dick really is, coming from the Christian tradition, there is this way in which that suffering has a sense of truth. But I think it's interesting here that it's pain and not suffering. Pain being, of course, just the experience of the nerve response, not so much the story we tell about it. Mercer, Rick said. I am your friend, the old man said, but you must go on as if I did not exist. Can you understand that? There's that as if. Right? He spread empty hands. No, Rick said, I can't understand that. I need help. How can I save you? The old man said. If I can't save myself, he smiled. Don't you see? There's no salvation. Then what's this for? Rick demanded. What are you for? To show you, Mercer said, that you aren't alone. I am here with you and always will be. Go and do your task, even though you know it's wrong. Why? Rick said. Why should I do it? I'll quit my job and emigrate. The old man said, you will be required to do wrong no matter where you go. It is the basic condition of life to be required to violate your own identity. And that's that point right there where we're being asked to go into ultra metacognition and just instead of just metacognition. That identity itself cannot resolve the paradoxes of existence. We cannot solve the problems of suffering on the level that we are inhabiting in metacognition. We need to look back at ourselves in that as if and see that there's something else that we can experience. It's the basic condition of life to be required to violate your own identity. So life itself is a higher form here that, if you'll excuse the verb, trumps even identity, right? That life itself is a higher power, as it were. And the only way we can really recognize life is to look back and to know the liveliness of ourselves, is to experience that awareness through that looking back at ourselves in an act of ultra metacognition. Because when we look back at ourselves, we find that we're a living thing. We find that we're lively. We find that we should accept ourselves for what we are, for these kind of finite beings that are asked to live in a contradictory domain where, we will be required to do wrong no matter where we go. That space of non-contradiction is not available to us as an identity, but it is available to us if we'll look at a higher logical level, a higher level of abstraction, ultra metacognition, where we discover that we are an aspect of consciousness, when we discover that we are an aspect of this evolutionary ecosystemic system with which we're enmeshed, which is what Rick is seeking to connect to through the goat and all the characters are seeking to connect to through living things. And which, no matter how much they become, status symbols, it doesn't ever actually even really remove the actual empathic encounter. Hence the grief of the loss of the goat, which is not just the loss of the money, although at first Deckard says we can replace it, but is in fact the loss of that in connection to the biological that they crave.
Yeah, Lindsay was mentioning something very interesting here about Mercer saying that very much like do your duty in the Bhagavad Gita, right?
Yes.
Go forth on the battlefield of reality, and you can't help but hurt another being to transgress your own identity. I wonder if that was conscious. I mean, I'm sure Philip K. Dick had read the Bhagavad Gita, or at least was aware of it.
He was definitely aware of it. It didn't come up that much. Shankara comes up more from that tradition in the exegesis, but I think that what's fascinating about the Gita and about this passage, both, a good point, Lindsay, is that you can discover this by following out the logic yourself, right? By observing your own experience in your life, that this idea that we have that there's some sort of egoic possibility of doing the right thing, however noble it is, itself has to be transcended. That we have to see that there's paradoxes in any system of law and any system of duty. So we just have to do that duty, even if, we're Abraham and we're told to go and offer our son up on the mountain.
There's an interesting aspect too with Mercer there, kind of going like, look, you're gonna, there's gonna be violence, there's gonna be transgressions, there's gonna be times where you hurt another being, but I'll be there. Mm-hmm. Like the world is not going to be, not yet at least, this kind of perfect divine reality where nobody hurts anybody, not yet, but I'll be there. So there's an interesting emphasis of presence that Mercer's saying, which is another theological statement by Philip K. Dick, that reality, there could be a divine aspect. We don't know how much the divine aspect can really do but suffer with us and be present with us, which is an interesting Christian theological kind of point of view there too, right?
And so it also links to the famous observation of Dick that reality is that which doesn't go away just because you stop believing in it. Right? That really, that what we, that we usually think of like, oh, that's the divine, or that's Jesus who's present in Dick's worldview here. But really, to go back to the Bhagavad Gita, that Dick is also pointing to this fact that there's an unchanging realm beyond the world of appearance, which never goes anywhere. And that we're involved in this quest to learn how to, evolve with that unchanging beyond the world of appearance. And while we're doing that, it's going to be downright Darwinian, right? Yes, things are going to live and die while we're on our way to, the next level, as it were. And I do think that, Dick would not have written this book the way he did if he didn't think that consciousness had a role to play in the self-repair, which is what he calls the Tagore vision, the self-repair of the living system on the planet, that consciousness is involved in self-repair, and that we can activate that self-repair by finding that unchanging aspect of reality that means that we're never alone. Remember, Mercer says, to show you that you aren't alone, right? That you have another aspect. We can call it the divine aspect. We can call it the real unchanging aspect. But that your local egoic aspect, that's going to get caught up in things that, are samsara, are, you can't govern the way in which that local ego is going to manifest.
So before we get to these one or two questions, that's definitely also, I know I brought it up in an earlier chat. I think it was one of these, or maybe it was the one from last year, but there was that quote from the exegesis that I found so striking, that he was saying, he was relating to Teilhard and Aurobindo and Tagore vision, and but Aurobindo, he didn't directly link Aurobindo, no. I don't think, but no. Teilhard. But Teilhard has this idea, right, that there's this spiritual being presence, accompaniment with us that we can turn towards, and there's this long evolutionary process of kind of coming to recognize the presence of the Mercer, right? The presence of the other who is there with you. And as you move your attention to that, it begins to kind of help you, right? You begin to have these instances of ultra Meta-Cognition, of compassion. That's where it starts. If there is going to be a better universe, if reality is going to evolve self-repair, it starts with this, right? So I just thought that was interesting.
And that's beautiful, because that points to the inner turn, the inward turn, that then will also come up in Three Stigmata, in this Christian figure of the Paraclete, the divine within us. That the kingdom of Mercer is within you.
So from Dan, he's saying, I'm curious if that eternal world is suggested by the silences in androids.
Yes.
The sheer weight of them. That's interesting.
Yes. That the characters, insofar as they feel alone, hear only vacancy there. Something's missing there. Right? Iran early says, that she wasn't really able to feel the emptiness. But you're quite right that the silence, once, in the Isha Upanishad, it says, fullness here, fullness there. When the silence can be heard to be full, when the silence can be heard to be what Ramana Maharshi calls the highest eloquence. The silence is the highest eloquence. When we can really feel that silence as the domain of the unchanging, then we've kind of lost we've let go of our aloneness, of our separation. Good point, Dan.
Yeah, that was a great catch there. Let's see if there's any other final questions here besides the transcript of the chat. Mike was mentioning that. Yeah, I just saved it. I'm going to save it again. So both texts, it's going to be a .text file. Those will both be on the class portal for you.
Cool.
Yeah, and because we've just got a great stream here. Mike's been sharing links for most of the class. I tried to share a few, a couple of different name drops for your notes, and some great commentary here. Okay, Mike caught a question that I was looking for. Thanks, Mike. What is the ultimate ultra meta cognitive act? Acceptance, forgiveness?
Yes.
That was from Erica. Yes.
it is interesting that forgiveness takes place twice in the Lord's Prayer, right? Something that God does and something that humans do. But they're just all variations on the same practice, I think. Surrender, acceptance, forgiveness, depending where we are, like what our blockage is at that particular time. If our blockage is some enmity that we're feeling towards another, then it's forgiveness. If if we're Mercer and we're doubting ourselves because our biggest difficulty is to make it through the day without drinking some whiskey, then he says, I don't judge, not even myself. Acceptance, right? Accepting who we are and what we are is, act of great compassion, in fact, instead of living in this, abstract image of who we should be. Sometimes the sheer amount of samsara can induce in us the sort of need to surrender. There's a beautiful moment in the very first chapter of Timothy Leary's book, High Priest, where, you're expecting that it's going to be an LSD trip or a psilocybin trip. But trip one is all about when it takes place out off the pages, but his wife has killed herself. He's resigned his position in Berkeley and he's gone to Spain with his 2 kids. And he's got the clap from a prostitute and his whole body is getting covered in these horrible water blisters. And he needs to go to a hotel that isn't totally damp and, humid so that he can heal up. And he's with his 2 children and they have a dog. There's no dog allowed in the hotel. It's a very Phil Dickian moment, actually. And the dog, shits on the floor and he has to try to clean up the shit. But he gets some toilet paper and he tries to clean up the shit. And he tries to flush down the toilet paper because he doesn't want the maid to find it, But the toilet won't flush. So he crawls over to the window and he throws it out the window. But then it catches on an electrical line and he says, "Flag of my mission," So it's this kind of horrible, struggle. It's like Joe Chip climbing the staircase in Ubik, if you can think about it. And he says, "I died, I let go, surrendered." Right? And he said, at that moment, something snapped, and I was just a male mammal with 2 cubs, high and free, period. And from that moment, he starts to heal. The blisters all start to go away. Everything starts to go away. So, it depends on where we are, in that quest. but certainly kind of ego death of that sort, of total surrender and letting go who we think we are, and being able to abide not knowing, would seem to be, the very apex of that achievement. But we can get there with forgiveness and with acceptance. So they're really all on a continuum. But from an egoic perspective, it can seem like that moment of ego death is the moment of change or metanoia. May we all have many of them.
May we. Marston just brought up the point that, the act of mercy, perhaps, as after all his name is Mercer.
I like it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's it for our questions, unless anybody has any last minute interjections before we wrap up. But I just want to thank you, Rich. And here's one. Just about, this is something I have to answer, whether or not to create a separate Facebook group for the students. If you all are interested in it, let me know. Just say yes in the chat box, and maybe send me. I got a message from somebody, I think Joseph. I got to get back to you, Joseph, about a discussion forum on Facebook. We've got Radio Free VALIS. We've got the Neuro Learning Facebook group as well. Not sure if those count or not, but we'll negotiate that afterwards. Cool. Erica says, yes, Mobius, Ultra Metacog, being able to abide, not knowing who we are.
Yes.
Cool. Well, great. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, what's our assignment for next week? Let me stop sharing here.
What is next in the sequence? Is it stigmata?
Is it stigmata? I believe it is.
Yeah.
I'll double confirm that for everybody real quick. But yeah, I think it is stigmata.
So I would say open yourself to not knowing who you are in the reading of stigmata. Open yourself to not knowing whether, that Eldritch is within you. Open yourself towards, the kind of atonement that Barney Myerson is interested in. And really, let it wash over you, and, fear not. It can be a terrifying novel. In fact, it can be, but just know that, anywhere, Dick really gets dark, a lot of times it's where the brightest light shines, like Ubik is a very dark novel in some ways, but it's also extraordinarily messianic, right? And so we can say, oh, well, those two things always go together. Yeah, but can we feel them, And so being able to see how the light really flows through Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, how it's really a kind of, it's a sacred book. I'm not trying to turn Dick into a religious figure or anything like that, but it's a sacred book insofar as it invites us into a space outside of time and outside of ordinary space. And this was, the religious historian Mircea Eliade's definition of the sacred. It's sort of like a place where time and space are suspended, and really opening ourselves to the full experience of Three Stigmata now that we've been in that empathy, and find those moments of empathy in Three Stigmata, because you're going to see again these themes of mind fusion, these themes of the constant quest for finding some kind of unity together, and then the commodification of that unity, and the difficulty of maintaining an ethical stance from the perspective of an individual. All are going to play there, but really open yourself to the empathy that's there, and open yourself to the space of not knowing who you are.
Excellent. So I don't know if this throws a wrench in what we were just saying, but on our list here,
it's
says
not
week 3, back to orthogonal time.
Yeah, back to orthogonal time. That would be Ubik.
That would be Ubik. Whoops.
Well,
yeah.
It feels like Stigmata wants to be read now, though.
So why don't we switch it?
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah.
I'll just make a note to make that note in the class portal, and we're good. Perfect.
Stigmata.
Let's go with it. All right, folks. And thank you, Rich.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thanks for letting me share what was coming through me. And I look forward to reading the text chat and so forth. And I'll jump on whatever Facebook thing you got, even though even Zuckerberg says it's poison.
Sounds good. As we're live streaming there.
Right.
Poison, folks, but, you know, the poison is the gift, I guess.
Use exactly. Use only as directed.
All right. Have a good night. See you next week.
Hasta luego.
Good night, all. Take care.